Welcome to another captivating story on our channel. If you enjoy stories filled with twists, suspense, and raw emotion, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. This story will keep you at the edge of your seat, so don't miss any part. Ethan and Sarah had been married for 6 years, their lives woven together by love, trust, and shared dreams. Ethan, a software engineer, enjoyed a stable career, while Sarah's role as a marketing executive meant late nights and occasional office events. One evening, Sarah mentioned an upcoming office party. Ethan encouraged her to attend, as he always trusted her implicitly. "Go have fun," he said. "You deserve it after all the hard work." The night of the party came, and Sarah left, dressed elegantly, with a sparkle in her eye. Ethan spent the evening at home, enjoying his favorite show. Around midnight, he received a brief text from Sarah. "Party's going great. Might be late, don't wait up." Ethan didn't think much of it. She often stayed late at such events, networking and enjoying herself. But as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., a nagging feeling began to grow. The next morning, Sarah returned home earlier than expected, claiming exhaustion and heading straight to bed. Her demeanor was unusual, but Ethan decided not to press her. Little did he know, that night at the office party was the beginning of a series of revelations that would shatter their world. After Sarah's return from the office party, Ethan couldn't shake off the odd feeling that lingered in the air. She seemed distracted, distant, and overly tired. Her usual morning chatter was absent as she barely touched her breakfast. He figured it was just the aftermath of a late night, but something didn't sit right. Ethan decided to give Sarah some space. After all, they had a solid relationship, and he trusted her completely. However, over the next few days, more strange behaviors began to surface. She became increasingly protective of her phone, never leaving it unattended, and her messages seemed to take longer to reply. On one occasion, Ethan had asked her a simple question about work, but instead of answering, she quickly changed the subject, her face flushed with unease. It wasn't just the phone. Ethan also noticed that Sarah had been taking longer than usual to get ready for work. She would disappear into the bathroom for long stretches of time, and when she came out, she looked perfectly put together. But there was something different about her appearance. More effort, more attention to detail than he had seen in a while. Ethan's suspicions began to grow, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Maybe it was just his imagination. But then came the phone call. One evening, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to take a peek at her phone. It was a calculated decision. He wasn't proud of it, but he felt something wasn't adding up. What he found shook him to his core. There, in her recent calls, was a name he didn't recognize. David from work. Ethan stared at the name for several moments. He had never heard Sarah mention a David before, and something in the back of his mind told him this wasn't just a casual colleague. Just as he was about to dig deeper, Sarah entered the room, and Ethan quickly placed the phone back where it had been. She gave him a curious glance but said nothing. Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that something had changed between them, and the small crack in their perfect life was starting to widen. The next day, Ethan couldn't help but question Sarah. "Who is David?" he asked casually, trying to sound nonchalant. Sarah froze for a moment, her eyes widening. But she quickly recovered and smiled. "Oh, just a colleague," she replied. "Nothing to worry about." But Ethan wasn't convinced. The way she said it, the hesitation in her voice, only fueled his doubts. After the conversation about David, Ethan's mind was spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was hiding something from him. The doubt gnawed at him constantly, but he wasn't ready to jump to conclusions yet. He had always believed in open communication in their relationship, so he decided to confront Sarah directly, but this time he needed to tread carefully. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ethan took a deep breath and decided it was time. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but filled with concern, "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier today, and I have to ask you, who is David?" Sarah's eyes flickered, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw a crack in her composed exterior. She paused for a second, her fork halfway to her mouth, then set it down and met his gaze. "I told you he's just a colleague," she replied, but her voice lacked the usual warmth. There was something guarded in her tone, something that Ethan hadn't noticed before. But Ethan wasn't buying it. He could feel the tension in the air, and it was clear that Sarah was holding something back. "You've said that already," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I can't help but wonder why you've been so secretive about him. Why won't you tell me more?" Sarah shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to find a way out of this conversation. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this," she said, her voice rising slightly. "He's just a guy I work with. We talk about work, that's it." But Ethan wasn't satisfied. His instincts told him that something wasn't adding up, and he needed answers. "Then why has he been calling you so much?" he asked, his tone pointed. "Why did you hesitate when I asked about him?" Sarah's expression faltered, and for a split second, Ethan could see the panic in her eyes. She quickly masked it with a forced smile. "You're overthinking this," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Nothing is going on. I swear." Ethan sat back in his chair, still not convinced. He had been with Sarah long enough to know when she was hiding something, and the way she was reacting only made his suspicions stronger. The conversation ended abruptly as Sarah excused herself, claiming she had a headache. As she walked out of the room, Ethan sat there, his thoughts racing. He knew something was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Was Sarah truly innocent, or was she hiding a deeper secret? The next day, Ethan decided to do something he never thought he would. He decided to follow Sarah. Stay tuned for part 4, where Ethan takes matters into his own hands, and the truth begins to come to light. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more twists in this mystery-filled story. The day after his confrontation with Sarah, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. His suspicions had only grown after the conversation, and he knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about their entire relationship, the trust they had built over the years, and whether it was all based on lies. He decided that if he was going to get answers, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Ethan wasn't one for snooping, but at that moment, he felt like he had no choice. Sarah had been acting strangely for weeks now, and the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something was wrong. The following afternoon, after Sarah left for work, Ethan decided to follow her. He had a plan. He wasn't going to confront her directly yet. He wanted to see for himself who David really was and what kind of relationship they had outside of work. Ethan trailed Sarah from a distance, keeping a safe gap between them. He watched her drive through town, not to her usual office building, but toward a different part of the city. His heart began to race as he followed her to a fancy restaurant on the outskirts of town. This wasn't a place she would typically go for lunch. It was upscale, private, and exclusive. When Sarah stepped out of the car and entered the restaurant, Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should go any further. But the need for answers pushed him forward. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked to the restaurant, pretending to be just another customer. He slipped inside and quietly found a seat near the back, where he could see Sarah through the window. Minutes later, his suspicions were confirmed. Sarah wasn't alone. She was sitting across from none other than David, her colleague, the man she had been so secretive about. They were laughing and talking, their body language too friendly for comfort. There was no denying it now. Ethan had been right to question what was going on. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen enough. He stood up and quietly left the restaurant, his mind racing. The betrayal hit him harder than he expected. Sarah had lied to him for months, hiding her connection with David. But why? What was she hiding, and how deep did this go? The next few days were a blur. Ethan spent his time gathering his thoughts and trying to come to terms with what he had seen. He felt betrayed, but there was no going back now. He needed answers, and he needed to confront Sarah once and for all. But little did he know, the secrets he had uncovered were just the beginning. There was far more to this story than he could have ever imagined. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind as he drove home. Every turn, every street felt like it was leading him closer to a confrontation he never wanted to have. He couldn't believe how his life had been turned upside down in just a few days. His entire world seemed to be unraveling, and he wasn't sure if he could hold it together much longer. That evening, Sarah came home late, as she often did these days. Ethan had already prepared himself for this moment. He sat in the living room, his expression serious. There would be no more pretending, no more acting like everything was fine. When Sarah walked through the door, she froze for a moment, noticing the atmosphere in the room. Ethan was sitting there, staring at her. His face a mixture of pain and resolve. She immediately knew something was wrong, but she didn't expect what came next. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, trying to put on an innocent front. But Ethan wasn't buying it anymore. He stood up slowly, his voice calm but steady. "I know, Sarah. I know about you and David." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah seemed lost for words. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she said nothing. Ethan could see the panic rising in her. She had been caught, and there was no way out of this. He had seen the proof, the undeniable evidence of her betrayal. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah stammered, but Ethan wasn't fooled. "I saw you with him, Sarah. Followed you. I saw the two of you together at that restaurant." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice unwavering. Sarah's face turned pale. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but it was clear she was struggling. "Ethan, she started, but he cut her off. "Oh, don't even try to make excuses. I'm done pretending. You've been hiding something from me for a long time, and I'm done being kept in the dark. I deserve the truth." The room was silent for a long moment. Sarah looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan could see the guilt in her eyes, and it hurt more than he expected. But there was no turning back now. He had to know everything. "Why?" Ethan finally asked. "Why would you do this? We've been together for so long. What was it about him that made you risk everything?" Sarah remained silent for a while before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Ethan. It's complicated. I never meant for any of this to happen. But I couldn't stop it. David. He made me feel seen, heard in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But I never wanted to hurt you." Ethan's heart ached at her words, but it didn't change the reality. Her betrayal still stung, and the damage had already been done. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep living this lie." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but Ethan could see that she knew there was no turning back. He wasn't angry anymore, just numb. The trust between them was broken, and it would take more than words to fix it. "I think it's time we take a step back," Ethan said quietly. "I need some space to figure out what I want. I don't know if I can continue in this marriage after everything that's happened." The silence between them was deafening. Sarah didn't argue. She knew that the consequences of her actions had led them here, and now she had to face them. Ethan left the room and went to the bedroom, leaving Sarah standing there alone, with nothing left to say. It was over. But what would come next? Could they rebuild their relationship? Or had this betrayal destroyed everything? The days following the confrontation were like a haze. Ethan couldn't seem to focus on anything. Work, friends, his own life. Everything felt like it had been thrown off course. The pain of betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth lingered, always in the back of his mind. Sarah, on the other hand, was distant. She had expected Ethan to be angry, to yell, but instead, he had calmly confronted her and walked away. She had hoped for a different outcome, a chance to explain herself, to fix things. But there was no fixing what had been broken. She spent the following days in a daze, trying to process the situation. She had lost the trust of the one person who mattered most to her, and nothing seemed to make sense anymore. She couldn't blame Ethan for his decision, but she also knew deep down that it wasn't as simple as getting over it. Every time she entered the house, memories of their life together haunted her. The empty silence between them felt suffocating. Ethan was no longer the same man she had married. He was distant, hurt, and unwilling to forgive. One evening, Sarah tried to reach out to him. She knocked on the bedroom door, hoping for a moment of clarity, hoping that things could go back to how they were before. But when Ethan opened the door, his face was cold. He hadn't been expecting her. "Ethan, can we talk?" Sarah asked softly, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before stepping aside to let her in. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stared out the window, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, but she pushed it down. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake. A huge mistake, and I regret it every day." Ethan remained silent. The anger that had initially flooded him was now gone, replaced by an emptiness that he couldn't shake. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Sarah," he said quietly. "You've shattered my trust. And without trust, what do we have left?" His words stung, but Sarah knew they were true. She had destroyed everything, and no amount of regret could undo the damage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her tears finally falling. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to the closet and started packing his things. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he knew he couldn't stay in this house any longer. The memories were too painful. The life they had built together was no longer something he recognized. Sarah stood there, watching him, helpless. This was the end. There was no turning back. "I think it's time for us both to move on," Ethan said, his voice low. "We can't keep living in the past, Sarah. I need space to heal, and I don't think we can do that together." Sarah nodded, even though her heart was breaking. "I understand," she whispered. With that, Ethan grabbed his suitcase, walked out the door, and left the life he had known for years behind. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he knew it was the right thing. He had to rebuild his life, find himself again. As he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if they could ever fix what had been broken. But for now, he needed to focus on himself. Sarah, too, would need to learn to live without him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: neither of them would ever forget the lessons learned through the pain of betrayal. And as time passed, they would both be forced to face the consequences of their actions. Thank you all for following this emotional journey. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this one. We'll see you in the next video.